索罗斯先生是一个非常坚定的市场这个 believer 啊，这个市场的坚信者，所以呢，在他的带领下啊，市场跟英国的这个政府，也就是跟英国的英镑啊进行了这个对决。那么最后还是市场的力量啊，这个赢得了这个当时。因为英国政府在干预这个英镑的这个汇率啊，所以在索罗斯带领下，这个市场呢冲击了英镑，最后呢这个英国政府撤出了这个英镑的干预。那么这是他的金融家活动。那么索罗斯先生管理着索罗斯基金啊，这个就是一直从事着这个金融的这个投资活动。这是作为金融家的一部分。我们这儿有个叫金部长啊，这个金部长曾经这个给索罗斯一本书写这个序言啊，我看了一下，好像2句话，一个叫聪明的金融家，慧智的这个慈善家。那么索罗斯先生也是慈善家，所以这些年来他也是一直在全球的网络在做着慈善，每年拿出很多的这个钱去做这个慈善活动。但是呢，这里还落一个就是索罗斯先生呢，也是一个非常他也是思想家他在他的从事的金融活动的时候呢，也是对他所金融的活动做出了很多的思考。这个写了很多的书，待会儿我也会问他，可能在90年代到2000年，甚至到现在，有很多的这个索罗斯先生也对这个世界金融市场有很多的这个思考。所以归根结底来讲，就是索罗斯先生就是3点：金融家、思想家、慈善家。我估计这种，所以呢，索罗斯先生因为他的金融活动呢，对全世界经济他会有很多的这个思考。那么现在我们就有索罗斯先生来给大家做检验。
So, my assignment today is to give you an overview of global financial markets. Well, the situation is very complicated, full of cross currents and cross purposes. In order to explain what is happening, let me put things in a historical perspective. After the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers in 2008, financial markets in the United States actually started to melt down and had to be put on artificial life support. They have been in what I call far from equilibrium territory ever since. The bankruptcy of Lehman was also the bankruptcy of prevailing economic theories, notably the theory of rational expectations and the efficient market hypothesis. The authorities succeeded in holding financial markets together, and the estate of Lehman has been liquidated. But the bankruptcy of economic theory has not been resolved. I come here from Hong Kong, where I attended the conference of INET, the Institute of New Economic Thinking, whose objective is to rebuild economic theory from the ground up. Mainstream economic theory has tried to imitate the natural sciences, but that is an impossible task. Social phenomena have thinking participants whose views of the world never fully correspond to the actual state of affairs. the divergence between the two introduces an element of uncertainty into human behavior that is absent in the behavior of physical objects like billiard balls or planets. I call that the human uncertainty principle. As you may know, I have developed a conceptual framework based on that principle, but I would be the first to admit that it's not fully developed and far from generally accepted. INET is making good progress in fostering new approaches, and I believe Chinese economists will be able to make valuable contributions because they are less firmly rooted in the dogma that has enjoyed a monopolistic position in American universities. The task INET set itself is far from accomplished. Neither the financial authorities nor market participants have a clear understanding of how markets really work. That's the reality, but few people are willing to admit it. As a result, misinterpretations, misconceptions, and a sheer lack of understanding play a more important role than usual in shaping the course of events. The current situation can't be understood without recognizing this fact. One of the highlights of the INET conference was a lecture by Lord Adair Turner, who has just retired as head of the Financial Services Authority of the United Kingdom and became the Senior Research Fellow of INET. He made an interesting point about macroeconomics, namely that the main task of macroeconomic theory is to prevent avoidable mistakes. The need for better theories has never been greater. As we look around the world, we find that avoidable mistakes are causing immense human pain and suffering. And this is particularly true of the European Union. Perhaps the best way to approach the current situation is to compare the situation in the Eurozone with what's happening in Japan. Japan is abandoning orthodox monetary policy and switching to quantitative easing after 25 years of stagnation. By contrast, the Eurozone is committed to orthodox monetary policy and fiscal austerity. In other words, the Eurozone is heading into a situation from which Japan is desperate to escape. By engaging in quantitative easing on an unprecedented scale, the Japanese government is embarking on a risky experiment. If the experiment is successful and the economy accelerates, there is a risk that interest rates will rise, making the cost of servicing the debt unsustainable. That's why the Bank of Japan resisted quantitative easing until now and perpetuated stagnation. Prime Minister Abe prefers to take that risk rather than to condemn Japan to a slow death. His bold adventure has been enthusiastically received by the Japanese public. I don't believe that the European public will put up with a slow death either. But Japan and Europe are not strictly comparable. Japan is a country, while the European Union is an incomplete federation, and there is a real danger that the austerity policy inflicted on the Eurozone may destroy the European Union. That would be a tragedy of historic proportions. The Eurozone is the main trouble spot in the global financial system today. The euro has many deficiencies in its design. Its major defect is that it has created a monetary union without a political union. It has a central bank, but it doesn't have a common fiscal policy, a common fiscal authority. The architects of the euro knew this, but they had reason to believe that when the need for a political union arose, the political will necessary to create it could be generated. After all, that's how the European Union was brought into existence, by taking small steps at a time, knowing full well that they are inadequate and will create the need for further steps. Karl Popper called this piecemeal social engineering. But the euro also had some other shortcomings of which the architects were not aware. What turned out to be a fatal defect was that by establishing an independent central bank, the government bonds of member countries became denominated in a currency that they did not control. This raised the risk of default. Normally, developed countries never default because they can always print money. And their currency may depreciate, but the risk of default doesn't arise. The risk of default is characteristic of third world countries that borrow in a foreign currency, like the dollar. In effect, the heavily indebted Eurozone countries were relegated to the status of third world countries without either the authorities or the financial markets fully understanding the implications of this fact. When the euro was introduced, the authorities treated government bonds as if they were riskless. Regulators allowed commercial banks to buy them without setting aside any equity capital, and the European Central Bank accepted all government bonds on equal terms at its discount window. This created a perverse incentive for commercial banks to accumulate the bonds of the weaker member countries, which paid higher rates, in order to earn a few extra basis points. As a result, interest rate differentials between the various government bonds practically disappeared. The convergence of interest rates caused a divergence in economic performance. The so-called periphery countries, Spain and Ireland foremost among them, enjoyed real estate investment and consumption booms that made them less competitive, while Germany, weighed down by the cost of reunification, engaged in far-reaching labor market and other structural reforms that made it more competitive. After the crash of 2008, the authorities had to substitute sovereign credit in the form of central bank guarantees and budget deficits for the credit of the financial institutions whose credit was impaired. That was when the need for a political union arose, but the political will was lacking. Chancellor Merkel declared that each country should look after its own financial institutions individually, instead of the European Union doing it collectively. In retrospect, that was the inception of the euro crisis. It was only at the end of 2009 when Greece revealed the true size of its deficit did financial markets realize that a European country could also default. But then markets raised the risk premiums on all the weaker Eurozone countries with a vengeance. This rendered commercial banks, whose balance sheets were loaded with those bonds, potentially insolvent, and that created a sovereign debt and a banking crisis at the same time. The two are linked together like Siamese twins. Once this is realized, a solution practically suggests itself. I shall spell it out in greater detail in a lecture in Frankfurt on Tuesday, because the solution can't be implemented without German support, and so you will have to wait for it until Wednesday. Let me now turn to other parts of the world. Surprisingly, the United States is emerging as the strongest economy in the developed world, and the dollar as the strongest currency. Shale gas and shale oil have given the US an important competitive advantage in manufacturing. Both the banking and the household sectors have made some progress in deleveraging. Quantitative easing has boosted asset values. The housing market has improved, and a pickup in construction is helping employment numbers. All these factors combined are strong enough to outweigh the fiscal drag exerted by sequestration. This is a fortunate combination that slows down the recovery and prolongs quantitative easing. Even more surprisingly, I'm also optimistic about the political outlook. The two-party system used to work by the two parties competing for the middle ground in order to win elections. This kept both of them moderate. Legislation usually involved bipartisan support and bipartisan cooperation. Then the Republican Party became dominated by extremists. The Democrats tried to follow them in order to regain the middle ground. That's how policies became one-sided, and the checks and balances that worked well for 200 years ceased to function properly. As you may know, I was very critical of the Bush administration and later on of the way the Republicans were obstructing the Obama administration. Now I think Republicans have overstepped the limits with sequestration. Hopefully, the Tea Party will find itself isolated, and the two main parties will revert to competing for the middle ground. Now let me turn to China. I'm not as well informed as I would like to be. China has been the main motor of growth for the global economy ever since the financial crisis. It's a smaller motor than the US consumer had been during the boom years, and that's one of the reasons why global growth has been so anemic. China must now change its growth model. It can't rely on export and investment-led growth any longer, partly because the rest of the world can't continue absorbing a chronic export surplus, and partly because the rapid growth of investments has reduced their profitability. Without profits, it's difficult to finance further investments. The investment boom has been financed partly by the household sector that was earning negative interest rates on its savings, and partly by the state-owned banks that accumulated bad debts. That can't continue forever. The current growth model can be maintained for another year or two, but not for another decade. The household sector has shrunk to 34% of GDP, and its savings are no longer sufficient to subsidize the other two-thirds of the economy. And the banking system is also in trouble. The obvious solution is to build a new growth model based on household spending. By improving social safety net and making it more dependable, the propensity to save can be reduced. But the transition will not be easy. Less investment will slow down the improvement in productivity, and the overall growth rate is bound to fall below 8%. The slower growth rate will also delay the break-even point of infrastructure investments, and that will aggravate the bad debts of state-owned banks. Moreover, the initial impact of an overall slowdown is to make consumers become more cautious. So the household sector may slow down at the same time. This increases the chances of a hard landing. One could see the beginnings of a hard landing last year, when the authorities ordered the banks to cut back on lending. Some of the problems I have mentioned began to surface and lead to a rapid expansion of the shadow banking system. Some borrowers, particularly in the housing industry, were willing to pay much higher interest rates even as their profits were under pressure. This raised the risk that the loans would eventually default. Most of these loans came from the wealth management and other subsidiaries of commercial banks. Wealth management products are not legally guaranteed by the parent, but so far the parent companies always paid up on the few occasions when there was a shortfall. To an American observer, the situation is reminiscent of money market funds, where one fund breaking the buck could cause widespread panic. Altogether, the rapid growth of shadow banking has some disturbing similarities with the subprime mortgage market in the United States that caused the financial crisis of 2007-2008. I'm sure the authorities aware of the dangers. They have both the skills and the resources to deflate an incipient bubble gradually. China has been successful in changing its growth model several times in recent history, so there is every reason to believe that they will be able to do it again, except for one factor. Vested interests are much stronger today than they were on previous occasions. The rapid expansion of shadow banking indicates that the vested interests were able to exert considerable influence over state-owned banks. If the American experience is any guide, the authorities have a couple of years to bring shadow banking under control, because it took 2 or 3 years of exponential growth in the subprime mortgage market to lead to the financial crisis of 2007-8. I think it's of the utmost importance that the authorities should succeed, not only for China, but for the world. So let me conclude by assessing the implications of all these influences for currency markets. Exchange rates have been remarkably stable since the disturbances caused by the financial crisis. They became unhinged towards the end of last year when Japan changed sides and adopted quantitative easing. The United Kingdom also became more aggressive with quantitative easing. This left the European Central Bank as the odd man out. Both the yen and sterling started falling against the euro and the dollar. After the Italian elections, the euro also came under pressure, leaving the dollar as the strongest major currency in the world. Nevertheless, the decline of the yen and sterling is likely to aggravate the recession in Europe. Practically, the entire developed world is now engaged in quantitative easing, with the notable exception of the European Central Bank. This is giving financial assets an upward momentum, but creating greater volatility in currency and bond markets. Quantitative easing is just another word for currency depreciation. It's not the optimum policy. Lord Adair Turner proposed some other alternatives at the INET conference in Hong Kong that would combine fiscal and monetary stimulus. But the euro crisis has colored the discussion about the perils of too much government debt, and it has distorted the political debate by overstating the risk of default. Consequently, there has been strong political resistance to using fiscal stimulus not only in the Eurozone, but also in the US and the United Kingdom. So quantitative easing is probably the best policy attainable in the prevailing conditions. But quantitative easing needs to be better coordinated because competitive devaluation is liable to create havoc. The lack of international cooperation in currency markets and the lack of agreement on the fundamentals of macroeconomic policy is reminiscent of the 1930s. This is very dangerous. I expect the next year or so to be very turbulent, with the euro at the center of the storm. Now, I have focused on the financial situation because that's my field of expertise. but I have the same concern about the political situation. We have too many conflicts and not enough international cooperation. I think China, which has escaped many of the financial strains that affect the developed world, could play a very positive role in promoting greater international cooperation. That would be an appropriate continuation of China's peaceful rise. Thank you.
我还是用主持人的这个特权，先问几个问题啊，然后我们就把这个open the floor 啊，给大家。帮一下那个George, don't worry. I mean, I'll do it in English. If you can speak a little bit Chinese, I mean, make our job a little bit easier. So, you talk about global quantitative easing. I mean, then tremendous liquidity is released from U.S., from Europe. So, what is its implication on China's monetary policy?
Well, I think China is following its own monetary policy, so it has to pay attention what happens in the rest of the world, and it does complicate the task because particularly with the yen depreciating, it creates more competition for Chinese products. So I think China
to have a sponsored institute. You were a firm believer of the market forces. I mean, when you were attacking British pound.
Well, I still am.
Okay. So, but now I noticed that you have, your new economic thinking, you're calling for more regulation on the U.S. side, I mean, and also global financial coordinated governance?
No.
Oh, okay.
No. I think we have to realize that while markets are extremely useful in bringing together different people with different views and bringing prices in balance, they are inherently unstable. That's a weakness they have. So instead of equilibrium, if you leave markets alone, you have more likely to have disequilibrium. And actually, you could have financial collapse if you have got too much credit in the system. So you have to make stability the objective of economic policy. You need financial authorities that make it their conscious purpose to maintain stability. You see, the authorities actually bought into the prevailing dogma that markets correct their own excesses, and therefore they don't need to maintain stability. And in fact, you had the crash. Now you have new institutions like the Financial Stability Institute and so on. So the authorities recognize the need, but they haven't yet established the correct methods.
Also, that's what you call new economic thinking. I mean, the market doesn't really, as all the economists they say, market, they can do everything. But now the market, they can do some. So they need the government to periodically step in. I mean, to
maintain stability by actually coordinating policies, because you have got different governments. You have a global market, but regulations are still in the hands of sovereign states.
Okay.
And they won't accept dictation. So it has to be voluntary cooperation that brings them together.
OK. 那么我们现在 open up the floor. I mean, OK, Mr. Jin, yeah, 有没有话筒啊？来，你用了。
Thank you very much. Nice to see you again here. As you know, I wrote a preface on your book, The Crash of 2008. For some reason, my preface did not appear in your Chinese translation, but it was carried by some of the magazines, and so people know your points. I made an analysis of your book, but I don't want to highlight this. But there are two issues which I would like to consult you about. The first is, certainly, this crash has created, I would say, huge problem for the mainstream Western economics. And I was involved to a certain extent in the report prepared by International Monetary Fund, which is called the IMF's performance in the run-up to the crisis 2008. And there are lots of details about why the IMF failed to predict the crisis. Do you think, the first question, do you think this crisis has led many economists to have a soul-searching, to reconsider the basic economic theories in the Western world? That's our first question. Second question, we obviously have seen a lot of changes in the regulatory bodies. To a certain extent, this is very much important to deal with the crisis. But also, some people are very much worried whether they might be overshooting. Over-regulation could be another problem for the global growth recovery, for the financial sector. So in these two areas, I would like to have your view to be shared with the audience today. Thank you very much.
Well, interestingly, the IMF itself is in the forefront of new economic thinking. They are more unorthodox, for instance, in the euro crisis, than the European authorities. So they are often at loggerheads because the IMF understands this instability, whereas the European authorities are bound by treaties that were concluded before the crisis, and they are not appropriate to these far from equilibrium conditions, but nevertheless they governed the behavior of the European authorities. And the authorities then have to find ways of tweaking and finding ways around the treaty to do what is necessary. So actually, Europe is governed more by lawyers who are interpreting laws than economists who maybe understand the problems better. So that's my view on the current situation of. As far as regulations and the financial market is concerned, actually, I think there has been a consensus, no agreement about the usefulness of financial services, of the financial industry. The financial sector contributed 30% of the total profits in the Anglo-Saxon economies, the United States and United Kingdom. That is clearly excessive. But a large part of those 30% earned but from other countries, so it was an export industry. So it's really there's a debate, or not enough debate, but there's no understanding whether it's worthwhile to get all those export earnings, but when the industry collapses, then you have to use taxpayers' money to bail out the financial sector. And there is now a prevailing view that the financial sector should not be bailed out. But then if you don't bail it out, it may collapse. So this has not been resolved at all.
Okay. Bob, I mean, I need to give some favors to the founders of the博鳌Conference.
George, thank you very much for that very lucid and penetrating analysis, and may I congratulate you on the lead you're taking, as you often do in many areas of human affairs, in initiating this new economic thinking. I have a problem. There is no doubt you're correct about the inadequacy of older theory to deal with changing circumstances and the need to think afresh in the way you enunciated in your address and in some of your replies already. My problem is this. Underlying all that you say, there is the unstated proposition, and that is that it will require sensible, intelligent political decisions to make the new theory and the new economic approaches work. And I believe, George, that this is an area of great concern. I think we are at a unique point in history since the Second World War. I don't say this as an ex-leader and that nothing was ever as good as when we were there. I think objectively speaking we can say that we are at a point for the first time in history since the Second World War, and I exclude China, that there is no outstanding political leader anywhere in the world. Not one. Now, if we don't have the art and skill of politics improving to match the new thinking in economics, we won't have the people with the intelligence and the guts and the imagination to apply the new thinking. Do you have some observation on that?
Well, actually, I have to disagree with your conclusion. Your analysis is correct. But we actually do have strong politicians. And in the area where you have the biggest problem, which is the euro area, you have a dominant figure, Chancellor Merkel. And she really is a powerful iron lady whose will cannot be resisted. The Cyprus crisis was a tremendous political victory for her. The trouble is that she is leading the Eurozone in the wrong direction. Now, also the problem is that different political leaders have different national interests, and it's difficult to reconcile the national interests somehow with the common interest. And again, the Eurozone is a practical demonstration of this.
那么我们现在只能最后一个问题了。这个我看看，那边那个是工商银行的副行长张红丽啊。OK。
Hey George, I have two questions actually. One is regarding the.
你还是问一个吧。
Okay. Regarding the regulations, clearly that is on the banks is punitive and also is political. There is concern that the politicians is local and is termed, while the issues we're addressing are long-term and global. So there's intrinsic conflict in there. So would like to hear your comment on that. And secondly, people will say that we have not learned our lesson through the crisis, and the crisis is going to hit again, or it's going to get bad or worse before it gets bad. would like to comment on that. Thank you.
Well, there is a serious problem because of what is generally known as the moral, as the what is it, the moral hazard. That is to say, as long as you make a profit, you earn good salaries. But if there's a loss, then the taxpayers have to take the loss. And why should you get then paid for the profits you make in good times? And I think that is a justified concern. And it hasn't really been resolved. As the second question is whether we have learned the lessons. But, well, probably not. And the trouble is that everybody is now looking for the next bubble. But while you're looking for it, they probably don't occur. And actually the danger now is on the other side, deflation. So again, the Eurozone is a perfect example. Everything is designed to fight the threat of inflation. This is the problem, that the next...
They will have a chance to talk to you. So now, on behalf of Secretary General of博鳌Conference, Ambassador Zhou, would like to give you a gift.